Many thanks for joining us today for our discussion around the return of theatre and some of the key themes that we see going forward. I'm Mark Chimampofo, so Head of Theatre at Moore Kingston Smith, and I'm joined today by a fantastic and very knowledgeable panel who are going to share their thoughts with you. First of all, we've got Neil Edelman, theatre lawyer from Harbottle and Lewis, who's very well known in the UK and in Broadway for his work right the way across the sector. So that ranges from working with producers, theatre owners, rights holders, the whole piece. Secondly, we've got Craig Manzino. He is head of the media and entertainment practice in New York at Armanino. He specialises personally in working with entertainment industry talent, so the people who are so central to the success of our industry. Finally, we've got Chris Morrie, who's a general manager at 101 Productions, very successful GM and executive producer firm working on a number of fantastic productions, including Dear Evan Hansen. And Chris personally oversees that show on Broadway in New York, and there's also a US tour, so very busy. So thank you all for being with us today. Chris, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. Hopefully, we've ridden out the storm, and I know you successfully reopened Dear Evan Hansen both in the States and in London. Now, you know the two countries took very different approaches to supporting their industry over the last couple of years. In the UK, it was primarily support to employers, and there's been some targeted grants that people are able to apply for with the use of supporting their return or continued running. In the US, payments to individuals rather than employers, and a much more guaranteed support to producers. And certainly on the face of it, we look at that enviously from the UK through the Save Our Stages grants. I think it'd be interesting to hear how that has either helped or hindered your return, and I guess really how you've found it.
Well, in the U.S., the assistance that came from the government was less targeted than it seems to have been in the UK, and that has turned out to be an enormous help. The government provided the Save Our Stages grants. It became known as the Shuttered Venue Operator grants. They were grants that were up to $20 million per production based on expense projections over the next year. That allowed the U.S. productions to know for certain that they could reopen. Whereas in the UK, those targeted grants were based more on need, as I understand them, and maybe Neil or Craig would be able to know more about that. But most West End productions that I'm aware of either didn't qualify or didn't apply, and therefore the businesses didn't get as much assistance from the government.
Yeah, and I mean, our Save Our Stages, the Shuttered Venue Operating Grant was one piece of it. I think the other piece of it, that I saw very closely was the PPP loans, which was going directly to the individuals, as Mark was sort of referring to, and the small businesses that weren't necessarily selling live tickets. And it was quite amazing to see how, and I'm sure with all government programs, when they're throwing billions of dollars in a few weeks into the market, there's always going to be some issues, and there was some pushback on some people that got it, but I really watched it save some people's businesses, as well as keep, the talent kind of alive with the help through the unemployment as well. The one thing I did note with the SVOG in the US was by the time it came out and you were getting the money, you were sort of getting it after the fact, and it was really for expenses you incurred sort of prior to getting the money in a way, Chris. And a lot of the shows weren't open and operating during that period of time. So it was, you sort of were getting money after the fact for for expenses you incurred. And there is a time frame going forward you could use it, but the timing of getting the money versus when you were supposed to spend it was definitely challenging to sort of traverse, since Broadway was closed during the time that they were supposed to be spending the money.
Yeah, that's true. It was certainly a cash flow issue at the very beginning, but you knew the money was coming. Like, you knew it was coming, and that allowed you to proceed with a confidence that, that on the UK side, it seems like producers didn't have. Um, so it is true that in looking at the challenges of that money is that it then became known as you began to negotiate all your settlements to get through and to reopen. Everybody knew you had this grant money. So the conversations are just different when you have been the recipient of a large grant and many other businesses haven't. So that made those conversations a bit more complicated. But just knowing that that money was coming really made such a huge difference.
I mean, I think there's certainly what I've seen is an interesting dynamic across the last 2 years where it felt like in the early days of the pandemic, UK producers, because of the furlough scheme we had in the UK, were in a position to support their companies quite significantly and be able to keep people on the payroll because there was government money funding them and funding them being able to furlough company members. I think, though, when SVOG came through, it was an absolute game changer that we didn't see in the UK and has made a material difference. I think there's going to be an interesting exercise, though, looking back in the future at the sort of two respective markets and the outcome of it all, because it's feeling slightly ironic at the moment that despite the much higher levels of SVOG support, because of some of the differing dynamics of Broadway, we're at a point as we're starting into 2022 where shows on Broadway are falling left, right, and centre, whereas many shows in the West End have managed to make it through one way or another. And certainly at the moment, there aren't any sort of significant numbers of what I would call COVID casualty shows in the West End. So I think it'll be interesting when people look back in future years and try and assess the sort of respective sports in both countries as to which ended up having the ultimately more beneficial effect.
And that's an interesting point, Neil. The SVOG grants certainly allowed us to reopen. It made sure that producers started out after the pandemic in no worse a situation than when they started it. But even though $10 million is a lot of money, you still have to go forward and you still have to reopen and operate in a pandemic. And when the grants were announced, when the Broadway industry was discussing reopening later in the year, there seemed to be a general belief that the pandemic would be behind us a little bit and that going forward we'd be, the reopening and having a little bit of a reserve as you go in, as you started operating again while you rebuild your audience. We didn't expect the Omicron variant and the devastating impact that has had in December over the holidays and now into the winter. And that is a factor that, maybe audiences in the UK might be weathering that a bit better than US audiences on Broadway may have so far.
Right. And also the US audience for Broadway is largely tourists and foreign tourists, which, we're definitely seeing, a great decline in that. I mean, foreign especially, you weren't even allowed in the country at some points. So I think it's partially the grants, but partially just how the countries handled the virus.
I think it does also throw into sharp contrast, though, how much more generally the West End is a marginal business, more so than Broadway. So costs are proportionately lower in the West End. It is the margin that producers need to take. I think any producer at the moment is simply going, can we survive week to week? No one's looking at making profits. They're going simply, are our costs covered each week? And it is marginally easier to do that in the West End than it is on Broadway, where where just the magnitudes are so much higher.
And Chris, something we've talked about was it, in a way, it almost opened the door for the shows that were showing up on Broadway. We were seeing sort of smaller plays finding theaters, which, usually, we only have 41 theaters, so space is usually a problem. And we found some smaller plays finding homes, probably because they were geared towards a more local audience as opposed to a tour bus type show. So it's just interesting to see that impact, and then we'll just have to see how that plays out going forward.
Exactly right. I would agree that would be one of the upsides of theater availability at that time. And as you say, we'll see how it unfolds going forward.
I mean, certainly availability of theatres, at least in London, has been one of the critical issues for a long time. But by and large, most of the large shows have come back and have reoccupied their original theatres, I think, in London. But I mean, turning to, I suppose, thinking about the audience, you mentioned the audience there, Chris. I mean, people are coming to see shows, which is fantastic news. But I think certainly one thing that we've seen in the UK is that the way in which people are buying tickets has changed. People aren't buying tickets months and months in advance. People are tending to buy them much later on. So producers are looking at much smaller advances and are really waiting on those individuals buying a ticket the week before, or even on the week or the night. Is that similar in the States, or is that different?
No, it's a very similar in the US. After the pandemic, the Broadway League stopped reporting individual grosses, so there used to be more public data available as to what each show was doing. So that no longer exists. So it's not quite as hard to quantify, but just a couple of weeks ago, in making a presentation to the unions, the league collected sales data and advanced sales data from a number of shows, and the contrast between advanced sales this time of year 2 years ago versus now was stark. I mean, even the unions seem to be taken aback by the difference in advanced sales between then and now.
And also, I think we were seeing decent percentages of tickets sold, but it was the average ticket price was a lot less, and so there definitely was, discounting and, things like that at play. But it was also, I think, one of the other issues was because of the quarantining rules, people were afraid to be out and test positive. I don't think it was that they were afraid to go to a theater, but if they did test positive and then they had a quarantine for 10 days, you couldn't go to work depending on what your job was, or you couldn't go see your family for Christmas because you tested positive. And so I think it wasn't that people were afraid to go to the theater or didn't want to buy the tickets. It was more of this quarantining rules, and we're really seeing that relax tremendously.
It's interesting that you say that about the mask mandate, because one of the big areas of debate over here in the UK has been about masks in theatres, where there was, until Omicron arrived, mask wearing was not compulsory, was optional, and theatre owners were sort of encouraging people but not compelling people. And there was a lot of sort of commentary within the industry as to whether it would be better to try and compel people because it would make some people feel more comfortable, or whether there were negative effects to that. And that was a big area of debate. And I suspect that we'll be heading back into that here with the sort of compulsory mask mandate dropping, as to the extent to which theatre owners should continue to try and compel people to wear masks.
Do you think the mask mandate hurts audiences, or do you think it helps? Like, without the mask, will more people choose to go because it's less of an inconvenience, or will it keep other people away, or both?
I guess it partly depends on your demographic, doesn't it? And the demographic of different shows, because certainly anecdotally, it is an older audience member or an audience member who feels more vulnerable, who feels more comfortable with a mask on. And it is a younger audience member who may say, I don't want to have to sit there for 3 hours with a mask on. Actually, I'm going to go and do something else. And obviously, the reality is that there are a lot of shows that do skew towards older audiences.
Yeah, we also had the issue originally where, children, people under 12 couldn't get the vaccination, and you have shows like Lion King, which relies on a younger audience, and now I believe starting next month, they will require a vaccination, on Broadway for children over 5 years old. So, there's just a lot of things at play here, and but currently, Chris, I think we're at 50% capacity on Broadway right now. Is that true?
The last number I saw was 61%, but that could have been 2 weeks ago and not the most recent. But that's about right. That's, it was in the fall, the numbers were in the 80s.
I mean, circling back a little bit, Chris, to reopening those shows, and also touching on some of the ways in which government supported people during the pandemic. I mean, the theatres were closed for a long time, and we have a big pool of people, both here and in the US, who are dependent on theatre traditionally for their work, and certainly. Anecdotally, there were stories of the freelancers, whether they're actors, costumers, whatever, taking temporary jobs, stacking shelves or whatever to make ends meet, and then later looking at other industries where they could use their skills, in particular film and TV, which emerged from the pandemic earlier than we did. In practice, was that a challenge for you, Chris? And I know, Craig, you work with a lot of these people. Have you seen people refocus outside theatre?
I believe most people came back to work when their shows reopened. There were definitely people who needed to do other things to make a living, so they pivoted. Broadway is always losing people to film and TV. It just pays better. And in recent years, there's been more production in New York, so there is more work in New York in other entertainment industries than just theater. But there were people who couldn't afford their New York apartments any longer, so they moved out and they moved on. And many have come back, most have come back, but certainly not all. It's just, the hiatus gave people a chance to reflect on what they wanted to do, what was important to them, and some of them thought the challenges of living in New York City and trying to make a living in the theater industry was too difficult, and so they are doing other things.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I've been preparing taxes for people on Broadway for 20 years, and so I've watched a sort of how this changes and what people do, and we always have the people who sort of throw in the towel at some point because New York's hard. And I definitely think this was one of those years, or 2 years ago was definitely one of those years where a lot of people sort of threw in the towel. And I agree, the pivot to film and TV has always been attractive, and it just was more attractive. We also saw more people, getting into voiceover work. But we definitely did have initially a lot of people moving. There was a lot of people moving to California or just moving elsewhere, knowing, especially, or down to like closer to Atlanta where a lot of TV is being made. But knowing that auditions became virtual and probably will stay that way to some extent. So people were not as concerned about needing to be in New York for the auditions. So we're definitely seeing more people expecting to be able to audition virtually, and if they get a job, they'll come back. But there definitely was that, initial exodus. But I definitely, have seen a change where, people have said to me, I think I'm going to move back to New York. I know I'll be working in theater again, and that's very encouraging. And I think there's that draw of live theater that these people can't get out of their bones, and that's here to stay. And that's why we're all in this business. It's something we're passionate about, and same with the actors. But definitely the government money was substantial. I mean, the unemployment was $1,000 a week, which that's more than some people were making working before. So that was very helpful, as well as the PPP money for the small business people, like the freelancers who used to operate on 1099. And they even opened up unemployment to freelancers for the first time, in my professional career, where people who weren't employees of shows or other businesses were able to collect unemployment, even though they were a freelancer, which that's, like I said, never has happened before. So there was definitely the government intervention was massive. And I've always told my clients, government help, that, the unemployment is one of the only ways the government still supports the arts in the States. So go get it.
And in the UK, actors and musicians are considered freelancers and are not eligible for assistance. They were not eligible for the furlough scheme as well. So that was another difference between the two countries in the way they offered assistance to the people hurting during the pandemic.
Yeah, we had quite a big issue here, and there was a lot of industry focus on the lack of support for freelancers. That there was alongside the furlough scheme, there was a freelancer support scheme here, a parallel scheme. However, that had quite tight criteria on it, which meant that quite a number of people working in the theatre industry fell outside it and were not able to claim. And it's certainly at the moment, anecdotally, there is concern in the UK that we are heading towards a potential skill shortage in the industry. We've got a burgeoning film and TV industry, which is growing apace in London, and there are a lot of stories of, particularly in technical departments, people getting out of theatre and moving into film and TV, and it becoming much more challenging for producers to fill roles in technical departments.
And Neil, you tend to get involved in projects at quite an early stage. Is there the work for those people in theatre? What's the pipeline looking like?
I mean, the great thing is the pipeline is looking very reassuring. There are one of the sort of things that I found positively surprising during the pandemic is the number of producers who kept their development programs going, who were still developing, who were still commissioning, who were still, as soon as they could, workshopping new shows. And certainly at the moment, I mean, you alluded, Mark, to the fact that there is yet again a queue of people waiting for West End theatres. And I guess that is testament to the fact that we've got a number of shows that are on a later timeline than they'd anticipated. So it's almost like we've got a sort of 2-year backlog of shows waiting for theatres. But coming behind them, there is still, it feels, a very strong pipeline of new shows coming forward. So that's the positive bit of news, is that hopefully there's some great stuff yet to come.
And I just want to add, the union in the US, I mean, only like 10% of the people in Actors Equity are working at any given week anyway. So this idea of being unemployed, it didn't really scare the actors as much. They're used to this sort of ebb and flow. This was obviously a major one. But this has been a problem in the industry for a very long time. How do these people make ends meet in between? So this was just sort of a longer example of that, but we definitely, I think, these people are very resilient and they know how to pivot. And they're here to come back strong. And I think people are very excited about it. And I agree, the pipeline we're seeing, I talk to producers, with projects, and they're like, my plate is full. I can't even look at another project. So I think we're ready for a big, strong return.
And sticking with that positive theme, that pipeline going forward, and resilience and ability to bounce back. I mean, we've all had to adapt to sets of circumstances we weren't expecting, and I think in many ways, lots of positives have come out of that as well as negatives. I mean, I suppose a question to each of you. I mean, do you think there are any sort of enduring lessons that the industry will take out of the last 2 years and sort of run with going forward?
I hope so. I mean, I feel like it's a little premature to say what what's enduring. We're, in New York, we're still in the Omicron phase of the pandemic. So, as we mentioned earlier, there was certainly some reason for optimism because we saw new plays, we saw new voices being presented on Broadway, which is a great development. It remains to be seen whether that will continue to be the case. Unfortunately, these shows opened up during the Omicron surge, so it was not the same even playing field economically as when other plays new open, which is already a challenge. So we hope that's an enduring element that goes forward. There's been a call for some reexamination of the employer-employee relationship. It seems a lot of shows are making positive steps in that direction. It's an ongoing, evolving situation, but hopefully those efforts will continue. We will see. And I'm just seeing more kindness. I'm seeing more compassion just from management, just between people, because everyone's so grateful to be back working again. Everyone's endured enormous difficulties over the last time, and everyone's very happy that our industry is coming back. And those are positives. Coming out of a pandemic, it's very easy to be compassionate to other people and to understand what they've all been through. And I hope that continues so that it doesn't take more pandemics for us to keep interacting in this way.
I think the other thing the next pandemic is not going to be the same. That's one thing I think we need to kind of keep in mind, that it might not be a virus that shuts us down next time. It could be something different, which needs a whole different set of solutions. So, what I'm sort of encouraging people or, talking about a lot is, we don't want to now shore up how do we prevent a virus from shutting us down, because it's not going to be a virus. It could be something totally different. So we really need to be very anti-fragile and really flexible in our thinking and our ability to recognize something, come together, work on solutions. And we can't try to prevent, we shouldn't try to now retrofit everything to prevent the next virus, because it might not be a virus. So I just think that that's what we have to recognize, that it'll always be something different. And it's just going to be about coming together, being a community, supporting each other, and finding these solutions. And that's hopefully something we've learned.
I think the only thing I would add on to that is that also, I think we're certainly seeing in the West and in the UK a greater willingness to question regular ways of doing things. So things that have been the same for 10, 20, 30 years, people are much more prepared to look again and how shows are produced, performance schedules, as Chris was alluding to, labor relations. And I think that then there hopefully will be some longer term good that comes out of that, and out of people sort of examining how the industry works, and whether there are bits of the industry and aspects of the industry that could work more effectively.
Yeah, one of those is definitely be the streaming of live theater. I know it's something we've been afraid of. The Met Opera does a very successful job at it. There's definitely issues with it, and there's nothing like being live in the theater. But I think we're now more open to it, and we're going to be more open to other ideas and other revenue streams, which hopefully will keep the industry as a whole, stronger.
I think that's fantastic. I think that sense of community and openness to change, I think, will certainly put us in a very good place going forward. And I think that's a fantastic place to end our discussion today. Really, really interesting to hear from all of you. I'm sure our viewers will think the same, and much food for thought. So thank you very much for joining me, and indeed for being so generous with your thoughts, and also thanks to everyone else who joined us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Neil. Thanks, Greg.